Alison Taylor, professor at NYU, author of Higher Ground Substack, thought leader, speaker of Truth to Power. Great. Well, welcome, Alison.
Yeah.
This is our London Salon. I've been trying to get Alison in person for some time. We've done a podcast with her. I, like many of you, have thoroughly enjoyed her voice on LinkedIn, on her Substack. I think she is not afraid to speak truth to power. And do we need any more? I think we've never needed more of that than today. What I've given, I think we didn't time this to coincide with a rather volatile run we've just had in markets, but I think it is particularly appropriate that we
Yes.
are now having this conversation. And what I thought we'd do is, first of all, this is going to be even better a discussion if we have contribution from the audience, because we want to hear what's on your mind. We want to hear whether you think we're overlooking aspects of AI in society, governance, its change, and just many of the topics that Alison covers. We'd love to hear your points of view. We're sitting here in London. The perspective, we have a more of a US centric perspective sometimes when we speak about AI. And I'm going to cycle through many of the themes that Alison has recently had on her Substack and as she's posted to LinkedIn. And we're going to go through one at a time, and let's see how we break down some of the conventional wisdom, I think, on things like that. So, what I'd love to start with is the recent Substack topic, which is around the shift in workplace culture. And some people in the room, we started writing about ESG, about D&I, and speaking about bringing one's whole self to work. And this was, I think, 2020 when we started to really get the kind of wind of that type of approach to governance and to running a company. Your recent Substack suggested that bringing your whole self to work was never the point,
Yeah.
or maybe not the point. Or I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And where are we now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose it won't be a mystery to anybody, or everyone will have seen this. Yeah, we went through kind of peak culture, peak inclusion, peak bring yourself to work. That started for obvious reasons with the pandemic. This also coincided with a high point of worker power. Probably peaked in around 2021, though there was an article in HBR that I always use in talks because I think it starts to reveal some of the contradictions. The article, I can't remember the title, but it was basically arguing that your manager should learn to provide basic cognitive behavioral therapy if there are problems with mental health on your team. The article, to be fair to it, I think it's called Helping an Employee in Distress. It was very thoughtful. It was very nuanced. It didn't actually say in the text managers should try to be therapists, but you need to start unpacking that. If we're arguing that the same person who is responsible for your pay rise and promotion and whether you keep your job ought to also be caring for your well-being, we need to ask if that's true. We need to ask what position we're really putting those managers in and whether that's fair, and whether, maybe even more importantly, it's fair to the employee. My rather cynical take in this article and in general is that the period from around 2018 to 2022 featured a lot of bring your whole self to work rhetoric, featured a lot of supposed data saying that employees and stakeholders want CEOs to stand up on social issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also featured a lot of data saying that employees will be more motivated and will perform more highly and possibly put up with lower pay if they feel that there is a purpose and impact to their work. So I think it was always framed to CEOs as a way to create more shareholder value implicitly. As the job market tightened and the political wind shifted, we have seen what's happened. Now we have headlines in the Wall Street Journal saying things like bosses are done being nice. And I think a lot of people feel betrayed. I know many people who work in DEI who now can't get booked and can't get roles and are having to kind of reinvent themselves. But I guess I would argue that the claims were always maybe not entirely bad faith, but always questionable. And in particular, I don't think we do young people any favors by suggesting to them they're going to find somewhere to work that will be completely aligned with their values, and where they'll be able to, walk their dog on a Friday and not have to meet any targets or hit any deadlines if they don't feel like it. Like, I don't think that was good for anyone in the end. We didn't need to swing in this pendulum-like way. We could have been a bit more honest and thoughtful all the way through, but that doesn't seem to be how we roll in general.
Really, it's a fascinating, slightly depressing take, I suppose, because I suppose that there was, on the one hand, I had a previous guest who spoke about Chesterton's fence and why was there guardrails about what you should bring to work in the first place. That clearly the idea of everyone bringing everything to work was probably not necessarily ideal. But I'd love to maybe ask here the audience whether you think that it is a depressing take that we cannot suggest that young people should find places in line with their values, or is there a middle ground maybe? I'm not sure if anyone has any thoughts, and whether working with young graduates, or is there a middle ground, or is it back to capitalism and what makes sense?
I think part of that is you've got to understand there's a tension. I mean, a company exists to service customers, to provide them value. Even you see that, let's not even worry about the capitalism sort of, pure miltiness there. It aims to do that and should always be thought of in that context of actually delivering value. And it made the same parallels in terms of investors. Fiduciary's duty is to provide the returns to its beneficiaries and to ensure that purpose is done. That purpose is always going to be different from your purpose. Any way that even your mother and parents, as much as you may love them, don't exactly have who you are in mind. They have their interests as well. And you've got to be able to transition between that. This is not a uniform worm. The advantage is everyone's diverse, but you need to be able to think about how do you support them in that purpose. Because ultimately, one of the phrases come back to me is, if your company is not making money out of you, then they will go bankrupt, if that's true of everyone. So they can only exist to the degree that they're making money out of you. And you always have to hold that context that they are different, whether you want to give them personage or not, from actually your own aim. So you need to be able to work through and see that. If you merge it together, you just create the blancmange. Maybe we'll move on to that in terms of AI. Everything averages out, and you actually miss that distinction.
I'd love to challenge the very academical viewpoints there, being a fellow actuary, to be fair. In order to get the best out of people, you have to understand the human side of them. So going to your point, if it's all about making money and sort of getting return on investment from what you're putting into people, surely you have to start with empathy, and you have to start with fully understanding what motivates them, what gets the best out of them.
So, but these aren't separate. Actually, what you're saying is actually from the view of the company, that they want to support their employees to get the best out of them. So that there is I didn't want to suggest that there's just a one-way dynamic.
Okay, so that's what I want
but that you actually have a sort of like a two-way dynamic within that. And actually say, if you're in an enlightened version, rather than, again, you sit on the XY spectrum in terms of management control, but actually empowerment is likely to be able to do it. But you actually need to create the structures. And maybe there's another aspect about the trust element in which to achieve that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
With empowerment and autonomy, for sure, AI topics. And theory X, theory Y, there is a middle ground. It's not an excuse to be inhumane. It's just, I think, about managing expectations as much as anything else. Kate wants to say something. I mean, the other thing that's kind of hard to miss is employee surveillance has galloped along. In fact, employee surveillance advanced greatly during this bring your whole self to work era. So another cynical comment I'm fond of making is bring your whole self to work, and it's only a matter of time before HR's in your home.
I mean, I was going to say, I absolutely agree with your analysis in terms of the pendulum swinging, and certainly saw, when I was looking at Microsoft, a huge emphasis on what we would call manager expectations, which were model, coach, care. So be a role model, coach people, and care about people, not in terms of necessarily having to be that cognitive therapist, but you need to care about the individuals who are working for you, and care enough about what their career path looks like.
Right.
So the care thing sort of can slightly pivot. But going back to the sort of generational shift that you were talking about, I would say my sort of working hypothesis is I don't think this is a generational clash. I actually think this is that we have workplaces. The working environment is not set up to be very diverse. I mean, the whole back to work is like, what are you doing with people who have caring opportunities or need to pick up their kids or whatever? I think this is a backlash against, some sort of 1950s image of what office life like was. When, I remember a female friend of mine at work saying, I wish I had a wife. That would make my life so much easier. And you're like, yeah, okay, that's it. So I think whatever the new generation is demanding, actually the backlash is against a workplace that is still designed, optimized for sort of 1950s, 1960s sort of commuting and somebody at home dealing with stuff and hierarchy. And so I don't think it's a generational mismatch at all, actually. I think the workplace isn't fit for purpose.
Right. Different people want different things, and different companies deliver different things. So you can get the matching between someone's motivation and what their role does by them finding a nice set of tasks that they like in a company they might not, or a company that does things they like, but it might be tasked. So like it is a bit, it can sound too bleak to say you can't get purpose at work. You can choose. The thing is, I think the expectation management point is really important, which is just don't turn up at work thinking you can have everything you want. That's not on offer. But there is a hell of a lot on offer. You need to make choices, take control of yourself. Your companies think about you, and some companies will value walking the dog on a Friday, and some will tell you need to be there till midnight. You can make choices. The less power workers have in the labour market, which is kind of arguably cyclical. Let's talk about AI in a bit. The harder it is to make those choices. But it's not like you must be an automaton and maximize output every hour of the day or you're screwed. The different companies will do things in different ways.
It's a good time to move to AI, I think. And maybe you can just take the conversation to that, because we talked about the erosion of trust. We've seen some, I'd say, fairly egregious and notable, they've been called out by the media, comments around the value of human labor.
Low
Recently.
value human
Yeah,
capital.
exactly.
Yeah.
There's been that. There's been the kind of the switching of human capital for AI investment, which is actually not a like for like switch in terms of quantum. It's much less has been saved through the human side than is being spent on the AI side. So how do you think that has accentuated this conversation around the value of humans?
I mean, I think we haven't moved through this cycle yet. Yeah, there was that comment. The CEO of ServiceNow also said, AI is amazing. They don't need lunch. They don't need healthcare. They can work 24/7. And so there's been a lot of this rhetoric out there, and why CEOs are saying such clueless things is a whole other question. Maybe we can kind of get into. The problem with those arguments is if we're thinking about productivity in that very narrow way, no one, not even a CEO, is going to be able to be more productive than one of these machines. So yeah, we immediately need to get to the question of what a human being is for and where human beings add value and what organizations are for and what work is for. I think we're obviously at the beginning of that conversation, but you're already seeing, and this is all US data, but we're already seeing the beginning of rumblings. There was a recent very interesting survey saying that 44% of Gen Z, and I think only 12% of boomers, are trying to stall the AI rollout, either by not using the tools or putting confidential data into public LLMs or, various sorts of kind of sabotage. And there is emerging data showing boomerang hiring. So there's been a bit of a kind of over-enthusiastic set of layoffs. As we all know, layoffs tend to juice the stock, but I think a lot of companies now thinking better of it. So one of the questions then is what happens to trust if you've been through this cycle with CEOs making all these statements and then realizing maybe it isn't super easy. And to the point you made, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but kind of autonomy and guardrails. I mean, there's enormous amounts of literature showing that what human beings want is autonomy over how they complete their tasks. So a good employer will put the guardrails and the governance in place and allow employees to experiment. The danger is if you've got this messaging from the top, no one will want to experiment, because what's the incentive to do that? I mean, at Meta, there's fairly overt messaging that you're training your AI replacement. So what that does to trust and motivation is kind of it's a question with an obvious answer. So short answer is, I think American CEOs are really screwing up and they're going to regret it.
Before I get into why, because I think we really want to know. Any thoughts on Alison's point there around the erosion of trust and just this the mismatch here between what's been said and what should be said? Go ahead, please.
Well, the next generation, we've heard their response at commencement speeches recently.
Yes, exactly.
And so superheroes from all of business or showbiz are coming with apparently positive messages about their future, but the audience isn't buying it, apparently. So that's a tension. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is. A bit more thought on both sides, probably, in response to this point about being realistic about what I think Michelle Obama was saying the other day, that people should be realistic about what the first jobs are going to be like, probably, even in an ideal world. But equally,
well, that's another. I mean, that's true. I've just been teaching graduating seniors, actually, and I think they are kind of realistic. But yeah, I mean, the other point to get on the table is regulation. So one of the reasons I think the US is having such a trust problem is there's no prospect of any meaningful regulation. In fact, everyone's just like, let this all burn through and we'll see what happens. To contrast with China, where they're being very explicit that they're going to protect workers, which is also fascinating in terms of who's got the moral high ground. But Europe seems to be, I don't know enough about Europe, so we'll love to hear from the room, seems to be being more thoughtful about the regulatory rollout. And so this also challenges the conventional wisdom that regulation slows down innovation. It kind of suggests the opposite's true. You need thoughtful regulation to give people the space, and your topic, psychological safety, to innovate.
I was just going to say, so I was involved with the future work and doing a longitudinal piece of research on this particular subject, which we did within Nationwide. And all of those things that you've just talked about and those other organizations, things happening in America, are polluting any kind of AI implementation that's going on in the UK, because like when we start off doing use cases and reviewing them, and they look like they might work, by the time you actually get around to implementing, the news cycles move at such a pace. If you're trying to implement GitHub Copilot to engineers, as we were, 1,000 engineers, by the time actually you're rolling out, what's happened is that they're already thinking that it's going to take their job away, regardless of whatever you do, because the news cycle is so loud. And so that's undermining the potential of the technology, and it's also undermining the trust, even if you are a trustworthy organization with a very high engagement scores as Nationwide was. So I think it's really interesting that how we didn't allow for that in our implementations, because we couldn't have known that it was going to come, but it's made things much worse. And so now people are disengaging in the technology before they've even actually engaged in it. It's much harder.
So the media noise is drowning out whatever your internal messaging and thought and design is, basically.
It's clearly, implementation is hard enough, right?
Interesting.
Like 2 or 3 times harder by the fact that this has already happened, because people are suspicious about what else might be going on, and also the technology actually, in their view, was not that great. When it actually arrived, which is a real.
Well, right.
So it's kind of it didn't meet the what was on the label, and training wasn't good enough, and all those things. So there are real challenges with the hype, because the hype kind of makes the product out to be incredible, but actually when you put it into practice, it's much more difficult, particularly if you haven't really used it all that action, you haven't got all the change management skills and job design skills and everything else around it to actually make it work.
Like most things, it's much harder than rolling out the technology.
On the regulation point, it seems that part of the fear of regulation in the US is that they will get left behind, that China will steal a march. And here in Europe, there's never been a fear of regulation, but you could argue Europe's starting from a point that's even farther behind. So will Europe's desire to regulate ultimately stymie it completely, because it's going to lose that edge if it had any? What do you think the middle ground is?
I was posting about this somewhere, and someone from Latin America made this really interesting point, which is that the regulation is in place there, but because it's not being implemented, that's kind of worse than having no regulation at all. So I guess one question would be how meaningful EU regulation is, given that there aren't that many big tech firms in Europe. So we might end up with a lot of balkanization. And I was just reading Bloomberg on the way here saying that the EU's not, getting really anti-American tech. So it seems hard to imagine that EU regulation will be that decisive unless you can suddenly create a lot more AI businesses and AI platforms in the very near future. But maybe, I mean, the conventional wisdom, and this would be more on sustainability, but the conventional wisdom, right, is that the US is all carrots and the EU is all sticks. So there is an opportunity, I think, to model thoughtful regulation, but I have a hard time thinking it's going to change the conversation that much.
Go ahead, no, please.
I'm just going to say, can I inject a note of optimism?
Oh, please.
I definitely don't think regulation is going to be able to solve this problem anyway, because it's, when you think about regulation, it's specific, slow, backward-looking and jurisdictional, and AI and tech is none of those things. And actually what we've had so far is just a massive sales pitch from the tech bros and an absence of a pushback from that, mostly because I think a lot of leaders are just overwhelmed by this huge new topic they've somehow got to get to grips with. But I think the sooner we start pushing back on some of this sales message, the better. And I wonder whether things like the recent court case in America where Google and Meta have actually been found responsible for addiction, and maybe the actual arrival of the bill for some of the behaviours that has so far gone unchallenged might help focus investors' minds to think about, actually, have we properly priced AI liability within companies? And I think I was thinking about this last week, that there are some commercially aligned forms of governance that aren't regulation that might be perhaps more agile and more practical. And the four levers, I think, are procurement, assurance, insurance, and investor due diligence. And actually they can do a pretty good job, if they're done well, at raising standards, even forget about the regulatory context. If, as I think we're probably all in agreement in this room, that actually building trust with your customers and not exploiting them, and building trust with your employees actually leads to better business in the medium term, then this might all have been, again, my hopeful moments, part of the cycle, because we've been at the beginning of a technology. It's been all about speed, but actually as the technology matures, we might move from speed to quality. And at that point, some of these governance measures become more valuable and maybe can point behaviour in the right direction.
I'm sure hope you're right. I mean, my impression is, and I was talking about this before everyone arrived, I gave a talk to a bunch of portfolio companies of a private equity firm, where the private equity firm and the leader of this private equity firm is obviously pushing so hard for these companies to adopt AI, didn't, really push back hard on me having any sort of skeptical narrative at all. And that's the impression I get. CEOs at the moment under a lot of push from their boards, lots of push from their investors to sort of cheerlead for this stuff, maybe some of them out of their depth. So again, we probably do need to see a correction, but I think it's starting. It will move faster than social media, because all this stuff is moving faster than social media. So somewhat of a collective realization. I think the other dynamic that's really interesting in the US context, I don't know what's the position here in the UK, partly because I don't understand politics here anymore, but it's bipartisan. The AI resistance is bipartisan. Amazing story in the New York Times about how the data center resistance is the most bipartisan issue since beer, and all these people kind of getting together who normally hate each other to resist these data centers. So I'm really hopeful it's going to depolarize the country. Hating AI will depolarize that.
Index shows majority support for AI regulation in the states, and more than 2/3 in favour, both Democrat and Republicans.
And indeed, and John Haidt, who I used to work for, has done this awesome job on getting phones out of schools in every one of 50 states by taking a very bipartisan view. So it's a model for how this can roll out. And given how hopeless polarization is, this is a hopeful note.
No, I think, go ahead.
We talk about AI, and I find it really sometimes quite difficult because it's such a overarching term when it can have so many different applications depending on what you're speaking about. And it seems to be more relevant, reflective of where we sit. Like, so in communications and corporate affairs, we're talking about large language models, we're talking about how to kind of curate words and images and all those kinds of things. But and I think this is where we get problematic talking about it and debating it. Whereas some of my clients sort of implement AI type tools, which is just gathering a huge amount of data and being able to bring it together is very useful.
Yeah.
And and how do we, I suppose, cut through with those examples that are very useful and can, to your point, can be kind of with specific business applications without it being kind of an either or. You have everything or you have nothing, or we can be more specific around people using it. And I think the platforms itself are going to be interesting because on the one hand, they want to have everyone in walled gardens attached to their one platform, which unfortunately is a problem because then you don't get plurality of information and knowledge. So it's how do we make sure we get everyone getting different information? But that's how they make money. So I don't know how the platforms are going to make, or the kind of the are going to make money. And I think if we tackle that one, because then if they cut you into walled gardens, then you're beholden to them, you're beholden to their data, and you can't go anywhere else. But they make money off you, or you have much more plurality around it, and then they don't make as much money. So I think that's where the conversation to control them has to be, because otherwise we're just pawns in this whole conversation.
I want to put a pin, not for on that making money question, because I think that gets to the heart of these IPOs and the financiers that are behind the IPOs and the retail investors that are being allured into participating in the IPOs at these valuations. I think that's we'll put a pin on that, but I'm sure there's something more to say on the AI use case.
There's all sorts of things about the .com bubble, about having a website called DIY.com, and that was a way to make millions. I think there's the sort of answer to everything. So can I build on Annabelle's point, because I thought that was sort of in terms of regulation, and I think the sort of what's interesting about some of this sort of EU and then maybe the sort of European regulation is it focuses on the end consumer. So what's the delivery to the end consumer, the sort of transparency and the quality at which that's done? How is privacy protected through that sort of system and those human rights around privacy and organizations in through? And I think what's interesting about that appropriation, so don't regulate the acts which would never keep pace, but actually regulate some of the outcomes and the end sort of touch point where there's a power imbalance. I think there's an interesting approach because that is a way of organizing the system incentives. So you don't necessarily need to instruct boards, clearly they'll go wrong, but actually when they start seeing the outcomes from it, their own self-interest, and going back to that point of them sort of having a sort of self-interest, that enlightened self-interest will help organize them about more responsible approach and about outcome oriented and things about that sort of radical idea of, delivering for the customers and thinking without the customers and without the revenues, they're not making any money, to actually get the system to flow through on that basis. So I think that, and just open that up as a sort of idea, a sort of way, the sort of regulatory structure can actually be used to actually organize those incentivization to avoid the sort of splitting between the sort of the company and actually the customer and those enlightened self-interests.
I have a question, mostly. I actually represent directors. I know some of the people in the room. I've loved your work for the longest time, and I find it fascinating how, that's your book had such immense kind of receivership and then silence because of everything that sustainability has gone through. I thought that was a bit unfair, so to speak. From your vantage points, because you come from the US, my understanding is that there is so much sponsorship and collusion of the tech bros, and so many trades that are, frankly, bloody illegal that are happening, and it completely inside traded, right? That between the tech bros and the current administration, that I find it hard to believe this bipartisan resistance to any of these applications, barring any landmark cases that Annabelle referred to. What do you think are the dynamics there, and how pervasive are they in the current environment and through November elections?
The collusion and insider trading is going on. Most of what I've read around that is around the Iran war, and people having advance warning of what Trump's going to do. There's huge amount of collusion between the government and the tech companies, not least because, or I've written about this, I can send you the article, not least because all these firms have absolutely enormous government contracts, even ones you don't think of, like Microsoft. So, you know, the government has considerable leverage over the private sector, which it is weaponizing, public shaming, litigation, cancellation of contracts, and has been, I mean, in general, is acting more like a populist authoritarian government than a democratic government. So in a democratic environment, you think more about your customers and other stakeholders. In an authoritarian environment, you have to think about what the government's going to do and whether it's going to retaliate. So that's a sort of structural dynamic. And then there's a kind of ideological dynamic on top of that, where a bunch of these people seem to have questionable political opinions and even more questionable mental health. Not that that's my prime concern. So that's all super, super scary. That all said, you know, I mean, the US is a really big, chaotic country, and it's a lot of stuff is localized, including the voting systems. So it's not super easy, I think, to kind of get top-down control on the general public. And Trump does pay attention to the markets, at least, and popular opinion. And so, I mean, November will be very, very interesting. I don't know how scared to be. But you are, you know, you're highlighting something that's very, very true and very, very scary. But I don't think that means the general public has no options. I also think the big multinationals are not going to push back against Trump because they're too visible. But if you're a smaller business, which most businesses are, and you're more locally facing and more community facing, then I do think you're starting to see the pendulum swing a little bit. And Minneapolis was very illustrative from that point of view.
The ice, what happened to
The big ice. There were loads of ice
raids.
raids. 2 members of the general public got killed. Weeks and weeks later, 60 CEOs wrote a sort of bland open letter. But I think behind the scenes were maneuvering. I mean, it was successful. ICE did pull back after this kind of collective public and community pushback. So that's definitely going on. I believe that $60 billion worth of data center projects are on hold at the moment because of community resistance. So that is a big deal. And people are worried about November. And so it's not as simple as just doing what the tech companies say, I don't think.
Absolutely. A bit more about directors' liability, at least in the US, and what could happen in Delaware to them if they do speak up and take a line that investors can claim to be damaging to corporate profits and returns to investors, because that's been the excuse, if you like, or explanation for CEOs being so reluctant to speak up and engage on issues, at least before the Minneapolis moment.
And we can probably make, I mean, this is maybe we're probably not finished on the populism point, but I think maybe just segue and then we can move back to populism. A bigger point of corporate governance are directors doing their jobs right now, regardless of these are complex. Think of quantum computing, AI. There was an interview with Sarah Fryer on the All In podcast where she talked about this Rubik's cubes, the unknowns, this funnel of doubt around the outcome of these companies has become wider and wider as revenue models come in question. So in a sense, the complexity of AI has grown so much. Our directors doing their jobs. And I think maybe on the liability point, we can tie them both together.
There's an amazing Ezra Klein interview with Jack Clark, who's one of the founders of Anthropic, who basically acknowledges no human being knows what these AI systems are doing already. So, and he's at Anthropic. So I don't know how much of a director liability is really a thing. It's been sort of interesting to watch the whole drama over BP, where I was talking to a journalist about this. I kind of think BP's problem strategy, not governance, and that BP's issues are a sign governance is working. If you look at Zuckerberg, the SpaceX IPO, I think Musk's got a clause in there saying he can do what the hell he likes for infinity. Jamie Dimon, CEO and chair of the board at the same time. I don't know is US governance fit for purpose? Don't know. I don't know if directors' liability is keeping them up at night as much as the cancellation of these big contracts and the public shaming and the the loss of business that can result. So
The Business Roundtable signed that thing in 2019, and one activist wrote, and General Counsel said, "Does this affect how you're going to run the company?" Went, "No, not at all."
exactly.
Just a statement that sounded good.
I mean, the obvious thing to ask about America at the moment is, why don't businesses get together and have more collective resistance? And they tried it via the trade associations, and Trump picked them off one by one with tariff policy. So that's somewhat of the logic for tariff policy, where there's no other logic. But I think it's a very good kind of way to pick off certain sectors and industries that don't toe the line. So I feel like all of that's keeping everybody up at night more than their potential liability. And I think they're thinking, if one of them's liable, all of them will be liable, and it's just going to be a big legal mess for years. So I don't know. Is governance working? It's like a rhetorical question.
Global companies separate out the US offices and completely from their other worldwide. I'm just seeing quite a few companies just they're headquartered in the US. They might have an overarching entity, but the entire structures are just set within the US, and they're separated and have completely from the European or the rest of the world. Is that becoming more popular? And is that because of these particular issues, that they don't want what may happen in the US be a contagion from what's happening in other markets around the world?
No idea. Does anyone know? I mean, operationally, communications wise, I think that's happening. Whether it's happening in terms of corporate structures, I have no idea. I can see the logic.
Essentially, I think in terms of the pendulum swinging, I would say there are certain issues are fairly bipartisan here in Europe around, say, things like climate change. I think D&I, there hasn't been the same pushback against it. Maybe sort of on the margin, there hasn't been as much, but
It's just not the same beast in Europe, DEI at all. Yeah.
Perhaps not. I think it's definitely ideas have contagion, but probably not to the same degree. On the corporate governance point, before we leave that, I do think there is an issue though about directors not doing their work, not challenging, not picking apart, kind of going along to get along. Part of my work around, just governance and psychological safety and boards and et cetera. And we've even talked about AI as a board member, because, needing that challenge, needing that kind of devil's advocate that's not really being present or not bubbling up from the human side. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on the governance side. Please go ahead.
So I have some experience around governance, and I would agree directors aren't pushing back enough. I saw a beautiful little thing on I think it was LinkedIn, where someone had done a little one page of effectively all the negatives about AI. And you think you put that in front of some directors to vote, like, would you hire someone who's going to lie to you and make things up and all of this? It's like,
Right.
well, he thinks it's a brilliant candidate. Would you go for it? No. So that's interesting. I think directors as well don't know what to do with AI, can't price AI like the
Don't know what
investors.
to ask. I don't know what
ask.
to ask. It's just like ESG.
Don't know how to frame it. I think that is also linked to a tendency for boards to be financially literate and people deficient. So that is an issue. If you actually look at the makeup of boards and their skill sets, then the people element is lacking. So there's nobody there except the Pope or somebody. So there's someone to look at. And the other point I would make about governance is that bad incentives trump good rules every time. So if the incentives are wrong, you can have all the beautiful codes and rules and everything you like, but they won't work.
100%.
So you have to fix the incentives, which comes down to your point about how companies negotiate back. What warranties can you put in place to say, well, if I take on your AI product, what warranties can you give me that it's not going to tell all my staff to kill themselves and all the rest of it? And be biased on gender. And if you can't do that, then the price I'm willing to pay is much lower.
Which is, of course, a massive accountability point, which is something that AI is lacking in general compared to human employees. So it's a really good point. On governance?
I'm a board director, and I think the underlying point here is not director liability, and it's not director illiteracy, if I may, and it's not director kind of a lack of understanding in the semi-well performing boards anyway. I think really what we're contending with is that the economy is not doing well, basically. And if there's no money at the table, then everything else that is non-money related becomes a bit of a luxury. DEI, most certainly Europe has been affected by it. You can see it in the stats going down. Climate, most certainly you can do that behind all these glossary boards. People say, you know, how much money has this thing made me? How much money is it losing me? And they leave it at that, really. And sustainability committees are pretty much struggling to explain themselves, you know, that, you know, their existential kind of role. Unfortunately, and I think, I mean, going back to my original question to you, this hype around AI has spilled over or kind of spread out this idea that AI is making people money. And there is no way that we can lose money, especially when our immediate peers are doing that. And therefore, if the economy is not doing well, people are overwhelmed for a million good reasons. Any sweeping statements around, you know, people not having the psychological statement safety to put their hands up and say, listen, I see a problem here. I think they're probably kind of inflated, if you will. Directors will ask very specific questions, or good directors will ask specific questions about what does this AI do for us in this division, in this area, in this thing. And therefore you will have very valid commercial conversations, particularly because the money is scarce. The problem will be when these sweeping statements, probably inflated by corporate affairs of these big companies that you mentioned, are saying, you're going to lose the bandwagon here.
Right.
And therefore, it's not a question of psychological safety. It's a question of, you know, taming kind of the environment and saying, what does it do for us that it makes anything for us? Because what I see right now is that frenzy that is difficult to discuss, rather than this psychological safety that is not there, etc., etc.
Well, we definitely have a frenzy. I think we'll come to that, but I know there's some
So the
more questions.
macro is more important than the micro board dynamics, essentially, or it's reflected in the board dynamics.
It's very micro. It's not macro. I mean, people are losing money, you know, from fuels, from supply chains, from everything, right? I mean, consumers don't have enough money to pay as much as they did before. It's not a macro anymore. It is very much a macro thing. And I think it will be interesting to see, as you said, how these IPOs are received, because, you know, we'll see how much froth has been priced in the system or not.
I think that framing it as resistance and sort of treating AI as like, just, you said it didn't have accountability, but neither does a CRM system or a robot, where it's a piece of technology. So of course it doesn't. Thinking of it in that way slightly, I think, takes that froth, the biggest claims, and kind of assumes they're true, but then says, but how do we deal with this? When actually some of the more like practical things, like change takes time. People need to deliver change. If you end up with an insurance liability, that's going to cost, like, there's a whole load of like, does it deliver something useful or not? Don't, like, if you don't see it as a like yes or no, maximal or nothing question, but in fact, just as another set of business problems and a societal set of issues to manage through, it becomes much more tractable. But you have to sort of pull the emotion as much as possible out of it and think, what are the benefits, what are the costs, what are the ways of managing it, what are the risks over time, what does it mean that like aggregated up over companies, therefore there's a regulatory case for action. At your point around West, like it can just feel very sort of rooted in fear rather than rooted in
FOMO driven by panic.
Yeah.
And I feel like we might be in an Emperor's New Clothes type situation where it's actually quite brittle. It's not based on a lot. It actually wouldn't take an awful lot for suddenly everyone to go, hang on, there are no clothes. But at the moment, no. And the number of conversations I have where people say, we just have to implement this AI program. What is it for? Don't know. We've just been told. What are the advantages? Don't know. We've just been told we have to do it. And it's nonsense. And I was realizing the other week, you know, when we're given our cybersecurity training, one of the first things that comes up on that is, if you're being rushed, that is a sign that you're being scammed. You're being you are missing the moment for critical thinking. And I feel like that's sort of slightly what's happening, and we just need to slow down and be a little bit more intentional.
Fast and zero slow.
Right.
And actually, we know that long term, you know, we can go through that crisis mode where fast is the right thing to do. But in all other times, it's the slow that you need to do. It's the slow that you need to organise and bill for. But at the moment, it's 100% pass.
So we did a piece of research looking at returns to companies from AI, global research. 74% of returns going to 20% of the companies. Those companies are 2 or 3 times more likely to have a responsible AI framework to build people into the change management. Like, obviously.
It's not obvious because that's exactly what you said. I mean, there's so much, and where is this? Don't know where is this instruction coming from. No one quite knows, right? And so it definitely is not coming back from the board. Where is that research?
It's a PwC.
Sorry, I'm really interested.
Go ahead, Graham.
I was just going to say, we also have been in an age of free AI for the last
Yeah,
few years.
exactly.
And now that's starting to change, where like people are getting into token maxing and so on. So I think the reality is business is suddenly going, oh, what? Hang on a minute, like this isn't free, and the realizing that there's a cost, and all the investors, the $1.5 trillion that have been poured into this, is going to somehow or another have to come back. So I think like there is that is finally catching up.
And like the Uber rollout, right?
Yeah. So
Cabs were cheap till they weren't.
I feel like it has lost our mind. We're implementing technology that would be like fresh for like 3 weeks. Like you'd never do that in any other circumstances. You know, we'd never do that. You'd like go, oh, we'll wait a couple of years, see if it stabilizes and so on. And so I think some, you know, we're in the things will settle, perhaps. But maybe someone will make a mess, and that's probably what will drive.
There's a lot of powerful actors, right, with a big impetus in making this feel big and overwhelming, and like you can't unpack it in this very practical way that both of you have done. You know, will we have AGI? Will it like take over the world? Will it, you know, and all this stuff? Whereas we do need, and that's kind of designed to intimidate people and make them feel like it's this big overwhelming problem and they don't know something about this area, so they can't kind of make basic critical comments. But I think we do need this kind of practical boiling down and us all to collectively sort of weigh in and not feel like this is some mysterious new thing, because at the end of the day, all problems are human problems, right?
I say, having worked for big tech, and even before going in-house, I worked in comms for technology for lots of big tech, and I'd absolutely survived the .com bust when I found healthcare PR really interesting, because there's no money in tech. So having seen all the cycles, and having been part of sales conversations, I don't think a lot of the traditional, in inverted commas, big tech companies, I don't think their sales playbook has really changed that radically. I think 6-7 years ago, we were talking about every company is a technology company. We were talking about digital transformation, of which AI was an element of that. So AI might occasionally be part of the conversations, but I don't think there was a complete radical shift. What I do think happened, obviously, is you've got newer, hungrier, resource intensive organizations that are coming and needing to be funded, need to find a market in a place where the mantra for big tech is scale and accelerate. Scale and accelerate is absolutely what is tattooed on the over the heart of every single big tech leader. Not only because they are absolutely really ultimately only judged on share price, and a lot of your talent retention is, you know, so many of these people in these organizations, their whole package is a huge chunk of it is shares, is equity that vests over a period of time. So the whole system, like you sort of buy into this system. But I don't think the actual playbook for sales has changed. I think what has happened is, what people have observed is that we're now part of a much faster global news cycle. And in the same way that you saw during the pandemic, a progressivism coming actually from kind of US activists and being activated on the ground here in the UK, I think the same thing is happening. So you have this massively speeded up news cycle and pressure, and consumers using it and using ChatGPT and talking about, and all of this stuff becomes this perfect storm. But I really don't think they sell it any differently. Sales has always been, you know, pretty aggressive and very forceful, and it's how they make money. think they have pretended otherwise.
Can I challenge you with a slight difference this time being quite made, or everyone's clear on we don't really understand what AI is doing or how it's
Yeah.
working for the first time. Whereas with smartphones and things, we kind of knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Is that a big difference this time that we're flying forwards with an ignorance?
I mean, I could say I can only speak to my own experience, but I think we were always talking very specifically about very specific examples. You know, if you are in the room and you are talking to people about multi-million, multi-billion-dollar investments, then there is a level of granularity that is required there. So I don't think so. I kind of think the hype is outside of those very specific conversations, and sales hasn't changed as radically as one might.
But Microsoft in itself, I mean, it has such massive effect and impact and on all big businesses. Like everyone is, like, you know, I don't know of any big business that is not a Microsoft company. And what they've done with that is also make sure that only the Microsoft kind of parts of it can talk to other parts of Microsoft. So when you try and put in other different areas, that gets made more complicated, and that's when all these programs fall down. So I do think there is a monopoly. You're not there anymore, so but I do think there's a monopoly that Microsoft has been able to, particularly for enterprise. And there's this difference between enterprise use of these tools and individual use of these tools. And I think the hype is individuals using it, and the barrier is enterprise use of it. And that's where you get those issues of people blocking it, not wanting to use the tools, fear for their jobs, not having honest conversations, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas the hype is like someone making stupid kind of posters in their bedroom.
For sure. And if you go back to the phone analogy, you know, you talk about mobile phones. So I remember working with Orange before they were EE on launching text messaging as a business. Right. And it was being launched as a business service.
Yeah.
So you could, in a meeting, send a message to your colleague about notes. It was never seen as something that would be done by, you know, teenagers or people who were flirting with each other. It was entirely predicated on this is a very, very serious business tool, and we can monetize the tech because they have to, you know, the tech has to talk to each other. So here's a way of us monetizing it. And so I think it's really interesting how it is that consumer usage and experience that can completely change business models, but also change the narrative in terms of how we think about it.
And it was frustrating when you were in a big business. I was working for a rather large bank, and you know, that frustration endlessly was the tech that we had in the bank and the restrictions we had with what we would have with our own phones and everything we do. And then, you know, and the bank was always trying to kind of match up with it. They couldn't because of the restrictions and everything that you have around that. And it's just, but yeah, it is that kind of, the people just, well, it doesn't work, so nothing to work and do at home, so therefore they block it.
Well, I just want to, I mean, we're kind of going to bring this to a close soon. Unfortunately, we could probably spend the afternoon here discussing it. But I do want to talk about the speed point, because I think there's two things happening. One is the speed of AI populism taking root. I mean, you spoke about the commencement ceremonies. I mean, this was a real surprise. And equally the same speed, I mean, I just heard a podcast this morning. 3 years ago, Anthropic was a kind of a social good organization that was maybe driven by research and to do good. And now they've suddenly kind of caught wind of the massive potential, and they'll be minting these centimillionaires across the board in San Francisco and beyond. So that speed is happening, and the race to IPO is phenomenal, I think, for any financial operative to observe. So I suppose, where does this, you know, how do you think this will end, or are you concerned about some of the governance aspects of this IPO process that you're seeing?
Yeah. I wish I had this would work, but I mean, yeah, the Anthropic's played the PR a lot better. They have a constitution which they've adopted voluntarily and ditched when it doesn't suit them. I think they played the Pentagon dispute beautifully. They've managed to position themselves, partly because Altman's got so many PR problems compared to a Modi, but they've managed to position it as a sort of OpenAI versus Anthropic kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, people that work closely with those businesses say there's maybe more thoughtful people in the guts at Anthropic, but the culture at the top is exactly the same. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I've just sort of made the argument Anthropic's playing the PR. I think it's interesting Anthropic appreciates how important ethics and responsibility is in the PR war. It's so fascinating to me. I think we seem to be in this low ethics era where no one cares. And yet all the consequential conversations are actually about ethics. And I think it's going to be extremely messy. I mean, Musk's SpaceX thing, I think, is not really. I mean, it's connected to AI. It's crazy what he's planning to get away with.
Valuation.
So, I mean, my rather pessimistic view, but Annabelle will rescue me, is that I think that something's going to really crash, and then there'll be a huge backlash, and we'll be in another era of high governance, and then I'm going to write a book called I Told You So.
Well, I think it's interesting because on the point of low governance, I think the point made here was that there was poor challenge at boards because the economy was not doing well. That may be the case in Europe. And in the US, the economy is doing quite well, despite the K-shaped economy and the consumer pain. The actual economy is expressed by the stock market, by the stats, the employment numbers. It's doing surprisingly well on the surface, maybe by the stats. So therefore, that's not the reason. There's poor governance there for different reasons. Maybe because there's just, again, a focus on maybe it's the focus on the bottom line above all. But also, it seems that the speed of populism taking root, and there's a midterms coming, and there's, as it's bipartisan, you mentioned the populism, the data centers, something is going to give, it seems, soon. Because
it feels like it.
And then it is the move, again, getting back to governance, the US government taking a stake. I mean, it's interesting. The jobs narrative has changed on a dime. That 180 discussion is going to take jobs. It's going to create jobs. The creation of jobs narrative seems now to be a more palatable one, maybe coinciding with the IPO narrative.
Yeah.
But then also the idea that the government will take a stake now, that seems to just be a direct response to the pricing point. That the pricing that you mentioned Uber with the taxis, I thought you were mentioning Uber, it's token usage.
Oh, well,
and switching the token usage to free models for the non and questioning the productivity. I think that is an emperor new clothes moment. That the question, I was at a conference in Dallas, and the panel said, "Oh, it's going to make everyone more productive." I said, "Show me how it's going to make us more productive, because it's actually making my life harder right now. I have more slop to wade through. I have longer emails to read. I find it harder at my age. I think I can discern who's a good worker, who isn't. Now it's harder to discern that because output has become uniform." So actually, that's not more productive. It's just I have more to do, as opposed to actually questioning, probably less productive in that interim. 1 minute to go. Can we have one last question for Alison, given the range of topics? Maybe you can answer my question, then one from the audience. Why are CEOs behaving as they are with their odd statements, creating AI versions of themselves? I think you mentioned that as being perhaps not something on everyone's wish list. Why are they making some of these statements?
It's a really good question. I wonder about it every day. I mean, I think there's something about isolation. I think there's something about the K-shaped economy, and that this is all a theory, and the way that if you are any CEO, you are rich enough that you don't need to go through an airport, you don't need to stand in a line, you don't need to take a subway, you don't need to deal with an ordinary person. And I just think it's terrible for your mental health. And I also think Trump has modeled a sort of shamelessness that I think also feeds into a kind of exhaustion with the ESG era. And they're like, well, great, don't have to bother with all that woke stuff anymore. And they're just kind of drinking their own Kool-Aid. It's not an expression I like, but just seems like they, like Trump, are surrounded by people that aren't going to tell them no. That is my only explanation.
Great answer. One last question, and then we'll have to two last questions, and then we'll call it.
I'd love to hear thoughts on tactical AI usage.
What is the probability of civil war in the US?
I think that makes the tax question an easy one. Let's start with the tax one.
Taxing AI usage seems like a good idea to me, but nothing is ever that complicated. I mean, the Americans have also partly modeled by Trump collectively deciding decided they're not going to pay taxes, partly because the IRS has been completely decimated and no one gets back to you. This is definitely true. They're not getting back to me. So it all relies on good implementation. And at the moment, we're sort of shredding government capacity willy-nilly. So nice idea if we can pull it off. I think it could be a while. Yes, absolutely. What is the possibility of civil war? I just don't know what that would look like.
It's quite a good film, mate.
Yeah. I think we'll see more and more shift to the state and district level and away from the federal level, and that's already kind of happening. So maybe it will be less civil war and more that we'll end up more. I mean, we're already more like the EU or like India, or the idea of a united America is a joke, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon, though I could be wrong. So I don't know that we'll see kind of open fighting as much as more and more and more localization, but yeah. Might not be. Yeah, no. I mean, New York's great at the moment, by the way.
It's not, yeah, it's fine. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. That's so nice to
I think
meet you.
as rich a conversation as we could have expected and more. And I think the good news is on her Substack, there is always more. And what I love is there's always links to other authors, other writers, other thinkers. And I think all these discussions, thank you to all of you for contributing to a robust discussion. Hopefully this can be round one. We can get Alison back or others for round two.
Love to.
And let's keep this forward.
And plug, I want to open up my Substack to other writers over the summer. So if you would like to write for me, please be in touch. Want to feature more and more voices as I move forward. So everyone in this room had a fascinating perspective. And so if I can persuade you to write for me, come on my Substack live, anything like that, please be in touch.
Yeah. And I'm Aoife Devitt, for those who don't know me, host of the 50 Faces podcast, which is there. Alison did feature on that. And also Markets Happy Hour podcast. And my day job as a global wealth advisor at Moneta.
Just a day job.
Yes, a day job. Please take a cookie before you leave. I do not want to go to my next client meeting with those in tow. And thank you again so much for your contributions. Thank you.